There are stories we tell to pass the time, and then there are stories that sit just behind the curtain of the ordinary, waiting to remind us that some warnings come too late, even when they're spoken by the very person who understands them best. If you're watching this right now, take a second, because the next 10 minutes might change the way you think about prediction, intuition, and the human cost of knowing too much too soon. And if you want more stories like this, stories that make you question the boundary between brilliance and fate, make sure you're subscribed. This is one you won't forget. It begins with a man who tried to warn the world. A man who saw danger forming long before anyone else believed him. A scientist so precise, so methodical, so impossibly ahead of his time, that he predicted the exact disaster that would claim his life. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally down to the very failure point he feared most. And yet, nothing stopped it. The year was 1985, and in a quiet office on the 3rd floor of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, a 44-year-old aerospace engineer named Roger boisterously typed a memo that would haunt history. Outside his window, the Texas sun burned through a pale morning haze, but inside the room, he felt the weight of something cold, something inevitable pressing into his thoughts. The engines of the U.S. space program were roaring again, louder than they had since the Apollo era. America was pushing toward a new frontier. Faster launches, more missions, more records. But boisterously wasn't paying attention to the glory or the headlines. His eyes were fixed on a quiet, almost invisible problem buried inside the solid rocket boosters that powered the space shuttle into orbit. At first glance, those boosters were miracles of modern engineering. 77 tons of steel, propellant, and precision. But inside them, hidden between the towering metal segments, were thin circular rings of synthetic rubber, O-rings as they were called, hardly enough to draw anyone's attention. The O-rings were designed to seal joints under extreme heat and pressure, but in cold temperatures, they stiffened. They lost elasticity. They didn't expand quickly enough to form a seal when ignition began. And boisterously understood something others didn't. A delayed seal in a live rocket booster wasn't just a minor design flaw. It was catastrophic. He leaned over his desk that summer morning and typed the words that would become one of the most chilling warnings in aerospace history. The result could be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. He sent the memo. He raised alarms. He warned anyone who would listen. But the machine of progress, political, financial, and reputational, had its own schedule. And the schedule didn't bend easily. For 6 months, Roger carried this burden. He spoke in meetings. He filed reports. He argued with managers who believed the risks were acceptable or exaggerated. Each time he tried to convey the danger, he felt resistance, like pushing against an ocean with bare hands. Colleagues remember the way he paced the hallways, rubbing his forehead, papers clutched under his arm like they were lifelines. He wasn't prone to panic. He wasn't dramatic, but his voice had a sharp edge to it, a tremor of urgency. And still, the shuttle program marched forward. Then came January 1986. NASA prepared to launch STS-51L, the mission that would carry 7 crew members into orbit, and broadcast a live lesson from space by Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher selected to fly. The eyes of the nation were watching. The media buzzed. Children across the country were set to tune in. The pressure to launch on time was enormous. But the forecast for the night before the launch at Cape Canaveral, Florida, predicted something almost unheard of in that region: a hard freeze. Temperatures are dropping into the low 20s Fahrenheit. Ice is forming on the launch pad. Boisterously felt something inside him go cold. He stayed awake through the night. Later, he would say he felt like a man watching a train accelerate toward a gap in the bridge. In an emergency teleconference with NASA officials and engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the O-rings, Roger and fellow engineer Alan McDonald explained the danger again. They presented charts, data, and test results. They recommended a delay. No launch below freezing, boisterously insisted. Not with those O-rings. For a moment, it seemed like the voice of reason might prevail. Thiokol's engineering team initially supported him, but NASA's managers pushed back. They questioned the data. They pressed for justification. They stressed the cost of another delay. They reminded Thiokol of the political pressure, the broadcast commitments, and the public expectation. Then came the chilling moment captured in internal accounts. Thiokol's senior managers asked the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The decision flipped. The recommendation to not launch was withdrawn. And Roger, silenced and defeated, watched the final verdict descend like a stone. The launch was approved. He hung his head. He later said he felt physically ill. That night, he drove home in silence. He couldn't bring himself to tell his wife exactly why he was so pale, so hollow. But she could see it in his eyes. Something had already broken. January 28, 1986. Morning frost clung to the metal of the shuttle stack. Ice glittered along the tower. Icicles hung like sharpened warnings beneath the fuel tank. Boyce watched the launch on television from his office in Utah. He sat in a straight-back chair, motionless. McDonald watched from the Launch Control Center in Florida, gripping the edge of the console. The countdown began. 7, 6, 5. Main engine start. A bloom of fire surged beneath the shuttle. 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. The Challenger rose through the blue Florida sky, arcing with graceful, unstoppable momentum. For 73 seconds, everything seemed normal. Then a puff of smoke, thin, gray, almost imperceptible, slipped from the right solid rocket booster. Roger's heart stopped. He leaned closer to the screen. McDonald froze, sensing something was wrong. Seconds later, a bright flash erupted. A plume spread outward like a splitting flower of fire. The shuttle twisted violently, engulfed in flame. Then, a silent, terrible bloom of white and orange tore across the sky. The Challenger broke apart. 7 lives vanished in an instant. In Houston, the control room fell silent. Engineers stared at the monitors, unable to breathe. In classrooms across America, children watched debris falling like slow-motion confetti. And in a quiet office in Utah, Roger boistfully covered his face with both hands and wept. He had predicted it. He had described it. He had tried to stop it. But fate or bureaucracy or pressure or human blindness had closed around his warnings like a fist. In the days that followed, the world searched for answers. Investigations began. Newspapers demanded explanations. Politicians pointed fingers. Boyce stepped into the storm, not as a survivor, but as a witness. He testified before the Presidential Commission, detailing everything he had tried to prevent. His voice shook as he recounted the memos, the meetings, the ignored warnings. The panel listened. Some panelists stared in disbelief, others in quiet shame. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was heartbroken. The O-rings were declared the primary cause of the disaster. Boyce's warnings were validated in full, but the validation came with a price. He was ostracized by colleagues who felt he had betrayed the company. He was criticized by some who believed he had spoken too openly. He struggled with PTSD, depression, and a lingering sense of failure, despite doing everything humanly possible. He once said in an interview that he still saw the crew's faces in his dreams. Yet despite the pain, he became a powerful advocate for engineering ethics, traveling the country to teach students about responsibility, integrity, and courage. He wanted them to understand that expertise carries a burden, that science does not only live in laboratories or theories, but in the fragile space between what we know and what we choose to do with that knowledge. As the years passed, Roger rarely talked about the moment he saw the disaster unfold. It was too sharp, too loud in his memory. But he never stopped speaking about the lesson, the one he nearly gave his life to show. When science warns us, we must listen. He died in 2012, 16 days before the anniversary of the Challenger disaster. Colleagues said it felt symbolic, as if his story had formed a perfect circle, completed, but etched forever into the machinery of history. Today, his memos are studied in universities. His warnings are preserved in archives. His name is spoken in engineering classrooms, not as a footnote to tragedy, but as a beacon. A man who stood alone at the crossroads of prediction and catastrophe, who saw fate approaching and tried, with everything he had, to stop it. And maybe that's why his story resonates. Because sometimes brilliance is a burden. Sometimes knowing too much is a curse. And sometimes the most haunting predictions are the ones that come true exactly as foreseen. This is the legacy of Roger Boisjoly, a scientist who predicted his own disaster, a man whose voice still echoes across time, a reminder that truth, even when inconvenient, must never be silenced. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of how fragile and vital human judgment can be, make sure to subscribe for more deep cinematic stories just like this. Thank you for watching, and remember, some warnings come quietly, but they come for a reason.